In this lecture, you are going to learn about the origins of the Cold War, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and NSC 68. World War II had two contradictory results for the United States. First, it made the nation the most powerful and richest country in the world. But the other outcome of the war, which is ironic really, is that the war also made the US feel the most vulnerable in its history. For the first time, the existence of the US is perceived as threatened and Americans feel vulnerable. Following World War II, the world enters another kind of war, the Cold War, which lasts for nearly 45 years. By definition, a Cold War is a state of extreme tension between the superpowers, stopping short of an all-out war, but categorized by mutual hostility. And this is what will make the United States feel vulnerable. The origins of the Cold War can be traced back to World War II. For example, although the Allies overcame a common enemy, the pre-war mistrust and antagonism between the Soviet Union and the West resurfaced over their very different visions of the post-war world. In 1945, in Yalta, Stalin, Churchill, and FDR decide on the fate of post-war Europe. Initially, Stalin promised free elections in Eastern Europe and then defaulted on that promise. Furthermore, the Western Allies' delay in opening a second front in Western Europe aroused Soviet suspicions during the war. At the war's end, Stalin wanted to make Germany pay for the rebuilding of the Soviet economy and to expand Soviet influence in the world. Above all, he wanted to make friendly governments on the Soviet Union's borders in Eastern Europe. In contrast, the United States emerged from the war with a vastly expanded productive capacity and a monopoly on atomic weapons, making it the most powerful nation on the planet. American politicians believed that the nations of the world were independent and should provide open markets for American goods and services. In this vision, free and open trade was necessary to prevent another depression. Many Americans were proud of their democratic system, believed in manifest destiny, and wanted to share their version of enlightened self-determination with the rest of the world, especially the newly independent states of Asia and Africa. Fearing a return of the Depression, U.S. officials believed that a healthy economy depended on opportunities abroad. Both American leaders and citizens regarded their foreign policy not as a self-interest campaign to guarantee economic interests, but as the means to preserve national security and bring freedom, democracy, and capitalism to the rest of the world. Moreover, recent history also shaped post-war foreign policy. Many Americans believe World War II might have been prevented had Hitler's initial aggression been resisted rather than appeased. The USSR had an entirely different vision. They wanted to ward off another attack like the one Hitler conducted during World War II by establishing defensive borders. And the best way to do so was by encouraging friendly regimes on its western borders. For this reason, they tried to extend influence in Eastern Europe after World War II. Soviet domination in this area denied US free access to market and opportunities to export its vision of democracy. A big historical question that is always in everyone's mind is, could FDR have avoided the Cold War? The truth is that it is hard to know what FDR would have done, but we do know that Truman was much different than FDR. The two men were totally different in background, character, and temperament. While FDR grew up in a wealthy family, Truman was the son of a farmer. He did not go to college. He couldn't afford it. So he turned to politics because he had no other options. Truman was indecisive, even though he had a reputation for being a decisive person. At 40, he was running a clothing store that closed. But then he was rescued by a political machine in Missouri, which made him the Democratic nominee for the Senate and got elected in 1934. He became vice president in 1944, but no one expected him to become president. Even when FDR was clearly ill, Truman was excluded from presidential decisions. He was not included in discussion of the bomb, for example. He was thus poorly equipped to deal with foreign policy, which is largely FDR's fault. Unlike LBJ, who was handed a job under similar circumstances and took it confidently, Truman felt inadequate for the job. Truman was arrogant, brash, and a bit insecure, which made problems with the Soviet, which had already begun, likely to gather momentum and escalate into a Cold War. The most notable difference between FDR and Truman was temperament. FDR could tell a lie to anyone if he had to. Truman was blunt, presidentially so. He was not diplomatic either. Moreover, Harry Truman came to the White House with very little foreign policy experience. With his temperament and inexperience, Truman turned the world into a football game between democracy and communism. He anticipated Soviet-American cooperation as long as the Soviet Union conformed to U.S. plans for the post-war world and restrained its expansionist impulses. However, Stalin was not willing to conform. Shortly after the war, in 1946, wartime allies contended over Germany's future, resulting in the division of Germany. Truman pursued a policy of atomic diplomacy. Because he had the bomb, he wore it on his hip. The bomb gave Truman and his advisors an illusion of power, and the results was an arrogance that haunted us. The bomb becomes the constant factor in dealing with the Soviets. But this did not work. The Soviets weren't frightened. By 1946, the U.S. administration had decided on a firm policy of confrontation. The confrontation became a fight between capitalism versus communism. Then in February 1946, Stalin gives a speech stressing conflict between communism and capitalism. Suddenly, it becomes very clear that we got two competing political ideologies in the world: capitalism, the American way, and communism, the Soviet way. Both countries perceive one another as trying to persuade the rest of the world that their way is the right way. But it also creates a false dichotomy in the world because there are lots of ways in between. Most of Europe has a mixed economy with socialist, that is state-run enterprises, but it's not a dictatorship. So there is a lot of misunderstanding and mistrusts on both sides simply because of our different political systems. As tensions escalate, Truman accompanied Winston Churchill to Fulton, Missouri, where the former prime minister denounced Soviet suppression of the popular will in Eastern and Central Europe, and famously declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent. From Stenton in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line are the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia, all these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow. Except in the British Commonwealth and the United States, where communism is in its infancy, the Communist parties of 50 columns constitute a growing challenge and peril to Christian civilization. We must not let it happen again. This can only be achieved by reaching now, in 1946, a good understanding on all points with Russia under the general authority of the United Nations Organization, and by the maintenance of the good understanding through many peaceful years by the whole strength of the English-speaking world and all its connections. Then, at the end of 1946, George F. Kennan, the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, sends the State Department a long telegram from Moscow, arguing that there is no use trying to get along with the Soviets. Stalin will not negotiate. Soviet foreign policy, he argues, is not formulated in response to events outside for the Soviet Union. Rather, U.S. gestures won't make a difference. The only answer is to contain the Soviet Union, to contain its expansionist tendencies. Kennan's telegram read to suggest that the Soviet expansionist behavior did not reflect insecurity. Instead, Soviets were aggressive, which was typical of totalitarian regimes and of communism. Kennan suggested that totalitarian and communist together will lead Russia toward a militarism that is unstoppable and unresponsive to gestures of goodwill. So where does this leave us? Well, it narrows the U.S. options considerably. Truman will then identify the Soviet Union as totalitarian, as the redder version of the same struggle the world had just been through with Hitler's fascism. And we lock American foreign policy into a pattern based on behavior we predicted about the Soviets, whether valid or not. So then in 1947, the United States implemented the doctrine of containment that will guide foreign policy for the next 40 years. Crises in Greece and Turkey triggered the implementation of containment through U.S. military and economic aid. Truman requests economic assistance for Greece and Turkey. If they fall to the communists, he argued, all of the Middle East might be lost. But the idea is sold to Americans by deliberately frightening them about communism. His words were, "It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempt subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures," meaning communist. Aside from the demoralizing effect on the world at large and the possibilities of disturbances arising as a result of the desperation of the people concerned, the consequences to the economy of the United States should be apparent to all. It is logical that the United States should do whatever it is able to do, assist in the return of normal economic health in the world, without which there can be no political stability and no assured peace. Truman warned that if Greece fell into the hands of leftist rebels, confusion and disorder will spread throughout the entire Middle East and eventually would threaten Europe. According to what came to be called the Truman Doctrine, the United States will not only resist Soviet military power, but also support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Its purpose should be the revival of the working economy in the world, so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist. Such assistance, I am convinced, must not be on a piecemeal basis as various crises developed. Any assistance that this government might render in the future should provide a cure rather than a mere palliative. Any government that is willing to assist in the task of recovery will find full cooperation, I'm sure, on the part of the United States government. Any government which maneuvers to block the recovery of other countries cannot expect help from us. Furthermore, governments, political parties, or groups which seek to perpetuate human misery in order to profit therefrom, politically or otherwise, will encounter the opposition of the United States. So with this in mind, on March 12, 1947, Truman announced $400 million aid to Greece and Turkey, where terrorist activities led by communists jeopardized democratic governance. The so-called Truman Doctrine became a cornerstone of American policy of containment. Congress authorized aid for Greece and Turkey and later followed with a much larger assistance program for Europe. In March 1948, Congress approved the European aid program, the Marshall Plan, and over the next 5 years, the United States spent $13 billion to restore the economies of 16 Western European nations. By insisting that the recipient nations work together, the Marshall Plan marked the first step towards the European Union. The Marshall Plan was the Truman administration's plan to rebuild Western Europe in order to prevent the spread of communism, facilitate global trade and free markets, and encourage European peace. Then the Soviets staged a brutal coup against the government of Czechoslovakia in February 1948. Unlike in Greece, Truman does not live up to his pledge of stopping communism, and he does not intervene to rescue Czechoslovakia from Soviet aggression. The Soviets will stage a brutal coup against the government of Czechoslovakia in February 1948, installing a communist regime. Even if the U.S. government does not intervene, the takeover of Czechoslovakia does lead to justification of defending U.S. interests all over the world, and thus to the globalization of the Cold War. After Czechoslovakia, the Soviets turned their eyes on Berlin. In 1947, the Western Allies had consolidated their three zones. Then they prepared to establish an independent federal German republic. The West's intentions were to create a German republic without Stalin's input. In June 1948, when US, British, and French officials introduced a new currency in Berlin, the Soviet Union initiated a ground blockade, cutting off rail and road access to West Berlin. The aim was to force Western powers to allow the Soviet zone to start supplying Berlin with food and fuel and give the Soviets control over the entire area. In response, Allies organized an airlift to carry in supplies. The United States organized and coordinated the massive airlift that flew essential supplies into Berlin for 11 months until the Soviets lifted the blockade on May 12, 1949. After that, Germany was officially broken in half. Berlin was divided into East Berlin, under Soviet control, and West Berlin, which became part of West Germany. On May 23rd, the western half of the country was formally renamed the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, and the Eastern Soviet Zone became the German Democratic Republic, GDR, later that fall. Berlin, which lay squarely within the GDR, was divided into two sections, and from August 1961 into November 1989, famously separated by a physical wall. Then something happened that would change the world forever. Russia detonates the first atomic bomb in 1949, ending the US monopoly on atomic weapons. Shortly after, a new chapter in the Cold War began on October 1st, 1949, when Mao Zedong established the People's Republic of China. A civil war had been raging in China since the 1930s, as communist forces led by Mao Zedong fought the corrupt and incompetent official nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek. Leaders of many liberation movements, impressed with the rapid economic growth of Russia, adopted socialist or communist ideas in China, although few had formal ties with the Soviet Union. But in the context of the Cold War, the rise of communism in China had another meaning. The US initially wanted to stop the spread of communism in China. However, after providing almost $3 billion in aid to the nationalists, Truman's advisors believed that further aid would prove fruitless given the ineptness of Chiang's government. Mao will ultimately win the war, and the nationalists fled to Taiwan. The United States supported the nationalist government in Taiwan, and since 1982, the United States has recognized Taiwanese sovereignty. Immediately after ascending to power, Mao signed a mutual defense treaty with the Soviet Union, fearing that the United States will support a nationalist invasion of China. Then the US blocked the People's Republic of China's entry into the United Nations. Coming so soon after the Soviet Union's successful test of an atomic bomb on August 29, the loss of China, the world's most populous country, contributed to a sense of panic among American foreign policymakers, whose attention began to shift from Europe to Asia. With China in turmoil, the administration reconsidered its plan for post-war Japan. By 1948, U.S. policy had shifted from decentralizing Japan's economy to a focus on reindustrializing it. Upon the loss of China, advocates of the new policy of containment quickly developed a defense strategy to back it up, the first aspect of which was the development of more atomic weapons. After learning that the Soviets had successfully detonated an atomic bomb, thus ending the U.S. monopoly of nuclear weapons, Truman approved the development of an even deadlier weapon, a hydrogen bomb. The Soviets soon followed with their own hydrogen bomb. With tensions continuing to escalate, a National Defense Memo known as NSC 68 was issued in April 1950. The nearly 60-page classified memo warned of increasingly terrifying weapons of mass destruction, which served to remind every individual of the ever-present possibility of annihilation. The memo said that the Soviet Union is engaged in a worldwide assault on free institutions. A defeat of free institutions anywhere is a defeat everywhere. It said that leaders of the USSR and its international communist movement sought only to retain and solidify their absolute power. As the central bulwark of opposition to Soviet expansion, America had become the principal enemy that must be subverted or destroyed by one means or another. The NSC 68 urged a rapid buildup of political, economic, and military strength in order to roll back the Kremlin's drive for world domination. Such a massive commitment of resources, amounting to more than a threefold increase in the annual defense budget, was necessary because the Soviet Union was animated by a new fanatic fate, seeking to impose its absolute authority over the rest of the world. The NSC 68 memo essentially echoes what Kennan had said and cements containment as the U.S. policy. But it goes further by calling for a massive expansion of the nation's armed forces. The U.S. must develop military forces sufficient for the task of defending freedom anywhere in the world. The Korean War brought nearly all of the expansions called for in the report, and by 1952, defense spending claimed nearly 70% of the federal budget. The National Security Document outlines the Cold War containment strategy and builds Americans' national security state as follows. For one, we need to further develop better, faster, and more atomic weapons. The U.S. also strengthened traditional military power. The US also needed to capture the hearts and minds of the world to spread democracy and capitalism. The US needed to strengthen friendly countries so they will not be tempted by communism. The US also needed to become stronger by forging military alliances with other nations. And finally, the US needed to establish a secret spy network to subvert communist expansion. So, as a big part of the strategic plan laid on the memorandum, the US needed to strengthen traditional military power, and we will see a significant effort to recruit more forces. In addition, women military branches became permanent, although they were limited in number and ranks. The European Recovery Program, which became known as the Marshall Plan, as displayed here, was meant to promote the idea of a greater Western integration, and after the NS6CCA memo, we will see a significant push to continue these policies. Then, in 1949, the United States joined Canada and Western Europe in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, to counter the Soviet threat to Western Europe. For the first time in history, the United States pledged to go to war if one of its allies was attacked. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization contains several members who aren't European: the United States, Canada, and arguably Turkey, and excludes quite a few European nations. But its expansion over time is key to the construction of modern Europe. NATO was conceived as an anti-communist military alliance. Initially, it was composed of countries that had fought together against Germany in World War II, but its anti-Soviet orientation and the heavy involvement of the United States created a context in which France and others could endorse the rearmament of West Germany. When Germany reunified as a NATO member rather than as a neutral, it set the stage for the alliance to continue expanding eastward and outlive the Cold War. In its modern form, the alliance is a source of security for Western Europe and a source of tension with Russia. The Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, covert action will become a crucial part of the psychological warfare with the Soviet Union and will also be an important aspect of the Cold War. The CIA was created to improve the government's espionage capacities and the ability to deter communism through covert activities. It also captivated the imagination of the general public, and we will see the rise in popularity of spy shows and movies such as Mission Impossible and 007 during the era. With the CIA, NATO, and military buildup, the NSC 68 memo will guide the U.S. policy of containment for the remainder of the Cold War. That is all for now. To learn more, please watch the next video lecture.